All right, that looks like that is working. We'll give it just a minute to see as people log in through YouTube as well as finish connecting through Zoom, and then we will get down to work. I hope that everyone's 2022 is off to a good start. It's our first chance to study Torah together in this new year. All right, well, I think that gives a time for people to log in. Why don't we go ahead and begin our study together. So we're going to begin today in chapter 11 of the book of Shemot, of Exodus, and then we're going to jump to chapter 12 because we need to do a little compare and contrast, as they used to call it in elementary school. We need to look at two different passages to see what they can teach us and the way that they agree and seemingly disagree about how the final plague will be handled, the 10th plague, the slaying of the firstborn. So let's begin in chapter 11, and beginning with chapter 4, we get the sort of setting of the stage. Moses said, "Thus says the Lord, toward midnight, I will go forth among the Egyptians, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstones, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And there shall be a loud cry in all the land of Egypt, such as has never been or will ever be again. But not a dog shall snarl at any of the Israelites, at man or beast, in order that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. Then all of these courtiers of yours shall come down to me and bow low to me, saying, 'Depart, you and all the people who follow you. After that, I will depart.' And he left Pharaoh's presence in hot anger." All right, so this is the warning of the final plague, and it is very much on rails at this point. Pharaoh and Egypt are not going to give in, and thus the final plague and the death of the firstborn is inevitable. But I want to focus on exactly who that firstborn is. Who is it that is going to be slain by this plague? We know the Israelites are not going to be slain, but what about everybody else? Well, we get this rather inclusive phrasing in verse 5, where it says that every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on his throne, to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstones, and the firstborn of the cattle. Now, cattle here is not really a great word. Behema is more for the word beast rather than just for cattle. So it's kind of like in English itself, the word cattle doesn't only mean cows, but it has come to mean that. So really, this is another example of how translations need to continue to be updated in order to keep up with the language they're translated in, rather than the language they're translated from. But language aside, this seems fairly extensive, that we are going from the firstborn of the royalty down to the firstborn of the slaves, and all the way through the animal kingdom. All right, so questions on the basic language here before we see the comparison text in chapter 12? All right, so in chapter 12, it actually happens, right? God is explaining as he outlines the holiday of Pesach, what is happening. And in chapter 12, verse 12, he begins his description of this final plague. "For that night I will go through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and I will mete out punishments to all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. And the blood on the houses where you are staying shall be a sign For you, when I see the blood, I will pass over you, so that no plague will destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be one of remembrance. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord throughout the ages. You shall celebrate it as an institution for all time. All right, so we're going to jump again in a second, but I just want to make sure we get this section here. Again, describing that it's going to be a strike against every firstborn. Again, the all-inclusive term that's being used here, wherever they are in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. Man, of course, being the Old English term for all humans. As we can see from the Hebrew, it is the word Adam, not the word Ish. Ish is more gendered, Adam is more neutral. Indeed, this is why there are many authorities that say that the fast of the firstborn, which is undertaken by Jews the day before Pesach, should also be observed by women, because they too were spared. For it was not only the masculine children that were spared from the strike of the firstborn, but that both men and women were spared at that time. But that is really the meat of another class. All right, so and then of course we get the reminder that that will not happen to everyone else, because everyone else will have the Jews will have put the blood, the Passover sacrifice, on their door. We good with that so far? All right, so what actually happens? Excuse me, scrolling is sometimes easier than jumping. Almost there, come on. There we go. Almost. There we are. And the Israelites, sorry, we're at verse 28 from chapter 12. And the Israelites went and did so, just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. In the middle of the night, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And then we get, of course, the response, which is as was predicted. But take a look at verse 29. And I'm just going to give you for reference back here in chapter 11, verse 5. Did everything go as planned?
There's an intervening event.
Yes, which is?
Pesach.
Which is the Passover sacrifice, which was commanded. But as far as the actual striking down, did that happen as was predicted from 11:5?
Well,
actually technically 11:4 and 11:5.
There is a carve out.
Okay.
The carve out, the folks who acknowledged, who performed the sacrifice, who did what the observed, who started their service of Adonai while they were still in the land of Egypt.
Exactly, and that can include both the Israelites as well as other Egyptians that joined them during the Passover sacrifice.
Right.
Right. So it wasn't only the Israelites by family that were spared. It was anyone that was, as you mentioned, beginning to connect to Adonai during this time. But there are a few other subtle differences that are not easy to spot, especially with the way translations work. So the first is that in the the early declaration of what was going to happen, it is said that it will happen ka chatzot halayla, that it will happen toward midnight or toward the middle of the night. Whereas in our verse here in 29, it happens bachatzi halayla, which means more literally at midnight or at the middle of the night. And indeed, there are some that argue that Moses intentionally used the phrase around midnight in order to avoid any arguments if the astrologers of Pharaoh had incorrectly decided when midnight would be. Remember, they didn't have atomic clocks to help them. It wasn't like they were waiting for the ball drop in New York. They would have estimated when midnight, and if midnight came and went without the catastrophe that was foretold, then even if it happened later, they might say, yeah, but maybe that was just something else, that was not what was predicted. So Moses softens the language in order to give a little wiggle room. Of course, God doesn't need wiggle room, and God actually does carry out the strike at midnight directly. So that's one very interesting difference between the prediction and the fulfillment. But there is another change that happens between these that has caught the attention of many of the commentators, and I'm hoping is going to be the entry point into our discussion about this plague in more general terms. And that is that the bookends of from the highest to the lowest change. We have the firstborn of Pharaoh, that is to say, who sits on his throne, down to the firstborn of the slave girl, who is behind the millstones, who is takes care of grinding the flour, and then in verse 29 we have, rather than the millstone, rather than the servant girl, we have the captive. We have the prisoner that is in the Beit Habor, the dungeon, the prison, the one that is a captive. And the question is this a difference? Were the millstone maidens higher or lower than the captives? Were the captives higher or lower than them? Are they the same people? Is this just an idiom? But anytime the language changes in the fulfillment from the language that was used in the prediction, our antenna should be going off, because we don't get changes of language in Torah accidentally. That's one of our principles of how we read the text. We don't say, oh, the author just felt like using a different phrase. Maybe, yes, in the sense that the different phrase was chosen, but it always would have been chosen for a reason, not for whim. So this hopefully will lead to our question in the first place, the underlying issue altogether. Why would anyone, either the millstone maiden or a captive in the dungeon, also be a target for this plague? Why wouldn't the destruction of the firstborn only be for Pharaoh? Or if we're going to extend it for other Egyptians, for the other powerful Egyptians? We've already made a distinction to the courtiers. Why not just limit it to their families? Or if we're going to make it at least for the other Egyptians because of their participation in the enslavement, then we certainly shouldn't punish other slaves, the millstone maidens, who would have been a form of slave at that time, or the captives that also would have been in a position lacking freedom. What responsibility could they have for which they would now suffer through the effects of this plague? So hopefully you have enough moral sensitivity and empathy to be wondering that question, because certainly our ancestors did, and our sages have tried to come to terms with this and to help us understand what was done and why it was done in this way. As always, the Torah is there to both create our sensitivity as well as to help us understand that the places where we are sometimes feeling uncomfortable do have reasons and do have explanations that are necessary and valid. But before we jump to those explanations and can debate exactly how convincing you feel they are, I just want to check if there are any other questions on this text or any other comments before we do so. All right. Okay. Let us jump in. I think I can increase the zoom another couple notches to make it easier for people looking on other screens. All right. So just a reminder, as a piece on the page so that I don't have to jump back and forth between too many different tabs, we have the translation there at the top about the original prediction being that it be the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstones as the bookend to the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne. So that way we can compare it to the commentary, most of which is taken from chapter 12, which deals with the change term of the slave that's in the dungeon pit prison. Okay, so first we have to just deal with the question of what really meant by it would be a smiting of everyone who lived or who was in the land of Egypt. Well, Rashi tells us that's very clear. When the word says everyone in the land of Egypt, it meant everyone who was in the land of Egypt. And yes, sometimes the word all does not necessarily mean the biggest definition of all. Here, Rashi says, no, this all really does mean 100% of the people who are not in an Israelite home are going to be struck. And that means even people that are part of other nations who merely happened to be in Egypt at that time are also going to suffer from this plague. So if you were a tourist there to see the pyramids, this would be a really bad night to be visiting. Now, do I imagine anyone would have been coming to Egypt as a tourist at that time after having spent a year with all of the plagues? No, this was not a good time to go visit the pyramids. But Rashi is trying to make it as expansive as possible, and we'll come back to some arguments about why that might be. But again, this should perhaps make us feel a little uncomfortable that people who were perhaps not even Egyptian would have been caught up in this final plague. All right, and what does it mean by the son of Pharaoh who sits on his throne? Well, there are some different ways to understand that phrasing. I know that our translation makes it look like it means Pharaoh is the one on the throne, but there is another way to read that verse, which is to say that the firstborn of Pharaoh is the one who would have sat on his throne if he had lived. That in order to reconcile the use of pronouns in the verse, rather than making it his throne, meaning Pharaoh's throne, it is the victim, which is the firstborn of Pharaoh. It is his throne, which is his hypothetical throne. And Chizkuni goes ahead and tries to help us understand what that would mean by pointing out that this would make that person the highest ranking firstborn. Now, this is an important distinction because in Judaism, there can be more than one firstborn. I know we tend to think of firstborn as being the firstborn of the man, but in Judaism, that's not how we define a firstborn. Certainly in the modern world, where most people practice monogamy, the firstborn is usually both the firstborn of the husband as well as the wife. However, in the world of polygamy, which Pharaoh certainly partook of, there would have been multiple firstborns, each to the different wives that Pharaoh had. And according to Jewish law, they all count as firstborns. And here, what Chizkuni is saying is that the firstborn that's being mentioned here is the highest ranking among those firstborn, i.e., the one that would succeed Pharaoh when the time came. For indeed, the Torah also hints that Pharaoh himself was also a firstborn, which we're going to have to talk about in just a second. But I just want to make sure we get this idea here, is that there could have been multiple firstborns in some families if the family was a bit larger. This would also work without polygamy, with serial monogamy. If a person were to be divorced or to be widowed or become a widower and then remarry a new wife and have a new firstborn, that person would also be considered a firstborn under these rules. All right, does that make sense? Of why we might need to clarify who we mean by the firstborn of Pharaoh. Okay. And what about Pharaoh himself? If he was the firstborn, then why wasn't he hit by the plague? Because if he's a firstborn, he's a firstborn. Well, Pharaoh too was a firstborn, but he alone was allowed to remain of the firstborn. And regarding this, it states in Exodus, "But for this cause I have kept you alive in order to show you my power." That is to say, at the Reed Sea. Sorry, that should be two E's in the middle of the word reed. So Rashi is saying that, yes, Pharaoh would have been a target for the plague had he not needed to be alive in order to create the panicked attack that would lead him and his army into destruction at the Sea of Reeds. So he was spared, not for any good reason, meaning not for himself, but he was spared because he would be instrumental in the next stage of the Exodus. Now, most of us probably can at least understand why Pharaoh got punished. Most of us can also perhaps understand why the next in line to be dictator, again, we're not talking about infants here, we're talking about young men that would have been raised in the power of Pharaoh and raised to believe they too would be a god king. We can perhaps understand why they were targets for this plague. But at the other end of the social economic scale, way down running the millstones, or way down in a prison cell, why and who would they have been targeted? So let's deal with the who first. This difference of language between the slaves that do the millstone and the prisoners in the dungeons. Right. So later on, the simile, meaning the image of the woman with the millstone, is changed, and the Torah speaks about the prisoner in the dungeon. But there is no contradiction, seeing that we know from Judges 16:21 that Shimshon, also known as Samson, as well as other prisoners, were obliged to act as horsepower, turning the millstones while they were incarcerated. So the argument that Rashbam is making is that it isn't that one thing was meant in the first section in chapter 11, and then a different thing was meant in chapter 12 for the results, but they were simply being referred to by two different labels for the same people. They were millstone pushers and they were prisoners. And they were just being referred to by those two different labels, but it refers to the same people. If you're not 100% convinced yet, Ibn Ezra has a similar argument. Yefet says that captives who grind the millstone in prison during the day are put into a pit at night whose opening is covered with the millstone. This is the meaning of behind the mill. So to be behind the mill means to be literally under the mill, or rather trapped into a pit where the mill is the lid, something too large to be lifted off and to allow you to escape. So they would both work the mill and they would be imprisoned by the mill. And thus, again, like Rashbam saying, we're talking about the same group of people. The captives and the mill pushers were one and the same. Making sense? Maybe. However, Tur HaAruch wants to give us an explanation of why the two different terms would be used. It's not enough to say that they refer to the same people. We still need to explain why God might have used one term at one time and one term at a different time. When the Torah reports about the actual plague happening, that's chapter 12, it uses a different example when describing the woman at the lowest rung of the social order, namely the firstborn of the prisoner in jail, as we've discovered. Actually, the Torah refers to the same person each time, just like Ibn Ezra and Rashbam had said. When the warning was issued, it was daylight, so that the prisoner was at work moving millstones. When the plague occurred, it was midnight, a time when all the prisoners are in their cells to prevent them from escaping. So he's giving us a reality check of why the two different terms were used at two different times. Because when the warning was made, Moses was metaphorically pointing at the people pushing the millstones at that time, during the daytime. But when the plague was being carried out, the text is pointing again at the same people in their cells where they are at nighttime, because they are not pushing the millstone during the night. And so we have an explanation of why the term changed, even if it was referring to the same people. But we don't yet have an explanation of why those people, millstone pushers and captives, either the same or even if they are different, of why they would be targeted by this plague. Because after all, they are still slaves or prisoners of one form or another. And isn't God liberating the prisoners? And isn't God liberating the slaves on this night? I mean, this night of Pesach becomes a touchstone and a calling point, a rallying cry for people that are imprisoned and enslaved throughout history. Well, Rashi gives our first explanation. So why of the captive? Why would they have been free? They have also been punished or hit? Because they rejoiced at the misfortune of the Israelites. That, yes, the captive, the millstone slave, might have also been a slave or captive, but that didn't stop them from looking down on the Israelites. Unfortunately, this is true even to our own day. Many people that are in difficult circumstances will often look for someone else to look down upon in order to feel superior, or in order to simply take pleasure in someone else's misfortune. And apparently, this is a very old human concept. A further reason Rashi offers why they were slain is that they should not say it was our God who brought punishment upon our oppressors, the Egyptians. So Rashi offers us the hypothetical, counterfactual. If the prisoners and the millstone slaves had not been punished, had not been struck by the final plague, then the next day they could have taken credit and said, well, being a Canaanite, it must have been my God that spared me from this problem. Or, being a worshiper of some other God, it must have been that God that spared me from this crisis. That if these people had been allowed to go, they would have used it as justification for further idolatry, or indeed strengthening their idolatry. So we end up with two explanations with Rashi of why the captive millstone worker would have also been struck by the 10th plague. I'm going to pause there and give you all a chance to not only digest, but perhaps respond, either with questions or comments on this point.
I think what Rashi is recognizing is that whether you're the most powerful and wealthiest person or the least powerful and poorest person, you have free will. You have a choice what you believe. They may enslave your body, but not your soul. And so even the poor had the opportunity, because we see before this, even among the servants of Pharaoh, some of the servants of Pharaoh feared the word of the Lord, feared the word of Adonai. So this is something, and even the people were, the Lord granted the people of Israel favor in the eyes of Egypt. The people could see, if you were poor and you thought their God is in charge, you could have gone ahead and joined them, even in spirit, if you're locked in a dungeon. But this is a reminder that even those who are poor and powerless, their faith is just as important to their lives as a rich person's is to his own as well.
Yes, if I can maybe just condense that a little bit, even people that are miserable can still be miserable jerks. That even people that are imprisoned or captive, are enslaved to the Egyptians, and their life is hard, they can still not do what's right. Like John said, they had the choice. They could have recognized this as God. They could have recognized this as not being their idol. They could have turned away from their idols, and they could have avoided rejoicing at the misfortune of the Israelites and joining in with the celebration of the Egyptians of murdering the Israelites' children and enslaving them and treating them so harshly. So there is, unfortunately, a lot of room for even people that are suffering to make the suffering of others worse, and to hold on to their own stupidity and ignorance in the case of their idolatry. So it's sad, it's frustrating, and we definitely have empathy for other people that are imprisoned, but that doesn't mean we have to applaud all of what they do or what they don't do. Now, Tanhuma, oh yes, go ahead.
If there was an Israelite in the dungeon, then, and if they were firstborn, then they died because they weren't able to be in a house with the blood on the the angel of death wouldn't have passed over them. Is that correct?
According to most commentary, yes, because there's a very powerful teaching in the Talmud that says when the sword of the plague has been unsheathed, even the righteous can be hit. Something that has taken on new and painful reality over the last couple years. That once a plague gets going, that we wouldn't expect supernatural protection to guard those that were in difficult circumstances that made them more vulnerable. And so, yes, most say that if they were an Israelite who was caught outdoors, meaning beyond the boundaries that have been established by the Pesach sacrifice, that no matter how good, righteous, or deserving they were, they too would have succumbed to this plague. And that is, another reminder, as we'll also see eventually when we talk about the Sea of Reeds, that when the actions that God puts in motion that we call miracles begin, we expect them to continue to roll according to the fundamental rules of nature around us. We wouldn't expect it to be pick and choose once it gets up and moving. That was why God demanded that we take steps to protect ourselves and not be caught outside. But yes, this would mean that some people, through no fault of their own, would have been caught.
Right.
Which I should point out is a more modern interpretation as well. I couldn't find it expressed in any of our classical commentaries, that the responsibility for those that were killed, whether it be the other enslaved people or whether it be the captives in the pit, or whether it be other Israelites that were unable to return to their homes for Pesach, the responsibility still lies on Pharaoh, not on God. Because it was the Egyptians that created the circumstances that caused this catastrophe in the first place. And had they simply behaved with even a modicum of decency, then no one would have had to die. Just a stark reminder again that it is only at the 10th plague that we have definitive deaths that are happening because of the plagues. There are potential harm and injury and difficulties in the other plagues, and some midrashim talk about deaths in other plagues, but it is really only explicitly said for the 10th plague that death occurred, which meant there were 9 other opportunities and months of time to have avoided all of this. So Tanhuma also wants to build on that same idea of why the captives were punished by saying that why were the firstborn of the captives punished? Because they had rejoiced in the decrees promulgated against Israel, like Rashi had mentioned. Hence it is written, "He that is glad at calamity shall not be unpunished," taken from the book of Proverbs. You must not be of the opinion that only the captives reacted in that manner, for the slaves and handmaidens did likewise, as it is said, even unto the firstborn of the maidservants that is behind the mill. That is, even those who were legally bound to the millers. So the Midrash Tanhuma is trying to use texts from Proverbs to remind us of the dangers of schadenfreude, of rejoicing in someone else's misfortune. This is a concept that has been railed against in Judaism long before the Germans coined the term of schadenfreude, and one that we would be well advised to continue. We too are still not supposed to rejoice at the calamity of others. Now, the Maharshal gives us a commentary that tries to help us understand Rashi. You may remember, because it was only right there, that Rashi brings 2 explanations for why the captives are also struck. 1, because they rejoiced, and 2, because they should not take credit for the miracle of their salvation coming from their God. Maharshal wants to explain why we get 2 explanations. Enslavement alone is not sufficient reason, as it was not a complete enslavement. And rejoicing alone is not sufficient reason, for no action was involved. Thus, both reasons are needed. Trying to explain that there were multiple faults that were involved in these other people who were being hit, whether they were complicit in the enslavement or whether they were rejoicing, that they did multiple things. That this was not a simply they sat in the quiet of their homes and chuckled at the problems, but that they also were engaged. And even if their engagement was not complete, and even if the form of enslavement of the Israelites was not the same complete enslavement as the chattel slavery in the United States, it was still combined enough for them to be targeted. And as with regards to that second part about because of we didn't want them to take credit for their gods, that also helps us understand why the animals were also targeted. Because remember, we've talked about Pharaoh and his family, we've talked about the captives and slaves, but we haven't talked about why the animals were struck. But Genesis Rabbah, Bereshit Rabbah tries to tell us. The firstborn of beasts were hit because they, meaning the Egyptians, worshipped these as gods. When the Holy One, blessed be he, exacts punishment from a nation, he punishes their gods at the same time. Now, this doesn't mean that their gods are anything like real, but it does mean that the punishment will be carried out in such a way as to diminish the people of that nation's respect for the idols that they worshipped as divine. Most notably, God wants to make sure that all of the Egyptians recognize that God is God and that the Egyptian gods are not. And so there are parallels in each of the different plagues that show us how each one of them is an assault on one of the gods of their people. For example, very famously, Ra, the sun god, would have been attacked through the blanking out of the sun in the plague of darkness. But there is another way to look at all of the 10 plagues, and I'm going to give you that selection here. And that is to look at all of them as being appropriate, meaning fitting. Midah keneged midah, as we described. So Rabbeinu Bachia says, God carried out his retribution on the Egyptians according to the principle of midah keneged midah, meaning measure against or measure for measure. The punishment being fitted to the crime committed. The Egyptians' principal source of faith was the dependability of the river Nile as their water supply, as the lifeline. It irrigated all their fields, and they had made the Israelites slave in order to draw the water from the river. God therefore turned the river into blood. The Egyptians made their Jewish slaves go out into the forests and hunt wild animals for them, a dangerous undertaking. They experienced what it means to be surrounded by wild animals who do not respect civilization when God let loose the invasion of their cities by wild beasts. By the way, you can look up the full commentary of Rabbeinu Bachia to see his description of the other plagues we just skipped. The Egyptians had forced the Israelites to look after their livestock. God therefore afflicted the livestock with pestilence so that they would realize that they had no right to force the Israelites to perform such duties. The Egyptians had made the Israelites carry hot water for them in their bathhouses. In retaliation, God made their skin break out in boils to remind them that they had no right not to impose these kinds of duties on the Israelites. In retaliation for the Egyptians stoning Israelites, God brought on the plague of hailstones. In retribution for the Egyptians having forced the Israelites to work their vineyards, God made the locust ruin the vineyards. Seeing the Egyptians frequently put innocent Israelites in dark prisons, God brought on the plague of darkness. Seeing they entertained plans of killing the Israelites who have been described as God's firstborn, God punished them by killing their firstborn instead. Because as much as we can be moved to feel uncomfortable or even sympathy with the Egyptians and others that were struck through the different plagues, we have to recognize that this was after an extensive period of incredibly horrible treatment. Yes, we should never rejoice at the suffering of others, but sometimes we do have to recognize that the suffering of others is not because of us, but because of them. And that suffering is something that could have been mitigated or even avoided had they made other choices. We still give multiple choices. We still give opportunities for people to change and to return. Like we talked about earlier, there were many Egyptians that did choose to join with the Israelites for Pesach and to leave the country. But we do also recognize that there is a time when giving more opportunity for change is only giving more opportunity for suffering and will not bring about a different result. And so by the 10th plague, it was necessary to finally take the nuclear option, if you will, in order to allow the Israelites and those who wished to flee the country and to find their freedom and their service of Adonai. It couldn't go on forever. And this text from Rabbeinu Bachya, along with many, many others, helps us remember that throughout all of the plagues, the Israelites were still slaves. The Egyptians may have been suffering and the Israelites may have been spared, but the Israelites were still enslaved during all of this. Had they not been enslaved, they could have simply left and all of the plagues wouldn't have been necessary. Unfortunately, that was not what the Egyptians wanted to do. So we should indeed diminish our joy. This is where the custom comes from, taking out drops from our cup on Passover as we recite the 10 plagues in order to diminish our cup of rejoicing. But we have to recognize that it still needed in the end to be done because of them, in order that they would finally have their will to enslave us broken and allow us to go free. Questions or comments?
I get it. Question and comment. It's certainly timely to be looking at the issue of how God uses plagues in the process of judging a nation or inspiring changes in behavior that people are resistant to. So thank you for shining this light on that.
Well, I mean, I appreciate that, although I would say I always find any section of Torah eternally relevant at any time. But yes, sometimes the connections and relevance can seem even more apparent. All right, then. Thank you all very much. I know this one was a little bit shorter than usual, so I hope people enjoy their extra lunchtime. And I will see you all hopefully tonight for Mishnah or tomorrow for Pathways to Judaism. And once again, I hope everyone is beginning their 2022, looking forward to some changes and avoiding any additional plagues. Take care, everyone, and be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.